Bonjour à tous. Bienvenue dans cette session Finance éthique ou Finance en TOC. Je suis sûre qu'un certain nombre d'entre vous ont une opinion bien tranchée sur le sujet. Alors, pour essayer d'y répondre à cette question, nous avons deux invités, deux orateurs de marque.
So, we're going to start. We have Aurore Laluc, who co-founded the Dublin Institute and who was elected to the European Parliament in 2019, and she chairs the intergroup on the New Green Deal and is extremely active. And we have Stéphane Boujna, he's a European. Euronext has grown since he became chairman of Euronext. It's a quotation platform, and it enabled Euronext to become the first quotation platform in Europe. Ethical finance or not. Up till now, the real concern was to fund the real economy, and we were worried about the weight of the financial sphere versus the real economy. And then it was decided that some investments were really absolutely necessary, but that their profitability was a very long-term one. And then we got the dictature of return on equity. So this issue of ethical finance is going to have to be simplified. Finance should not lack morality and should. So we're going to continue with the moral dimension of this discussion, as this is an economic meeting and not a philosophical one. And we have no time to talk about the non-ethical behaviors of financial or non-financial stakeholders. Today, we're going to focus on the inclusion of extra financial criteria in the decision-making process of stakeholders. This issue has developed a lot over time. In the last century, it appeared with the principle of exclusion. Some investment had to be excluded, or with the topic of social responsibility, which appeared in the mid-20th century. Very famous economist talked a lot about that. I'm talking about Milton Friedman, for whom the sole social responsibility of a company was to its shareholders. So that was clear. Then with the year 2000, the concept evolved. We saw the notion of sustainable investment and or responsible investment, and with time came sustainable investment, with the factoring in of three main criteria: the famous environmental, social, and governance criteria. Each group of criterion has a subgroup, let's say, with a lot of sub-criteria, and everybody agrees that finance has to be sustainable and also ethical, but the geostrategic or political dimension has integrated the discussion. How can you reconcile investments in weapons and defense with these criteria? So it is an extremely complicated situation, and the problems of some companies are problems. We have Wirecard in Germany, the TomTom, the cryptos, empty shells such as SPACs. The list could be long, but it would be a pity to only think about this list, because nevertheless, probably due to the regulations, there has been an improvement in the type of investments to make finance a bit more sustainable. So my question to the two speakers, what is your definition of an ethical finance, and what is your opinion about the present situation? Stéphane. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a great honor to be here with Aurore, because Aurore Lalucq was elected to the European Parliament, and she took over with great efficiency and discretion what Pervenche Berès or Mr. Lamassoure used to do in the past, i.e. a small group of members of the European Parliament who have been working very hard to enable European regulations to take into account the ethical preferences of France. So not all European parliamentaries have the same impact, I must say. Aix-en-Provence is not a place where you can give the various notions. It's a place where you have discussions and you talk science, and whatever you say is always very pleasant. So the title of this is a bit of a hold-all, which was probably formulated to fill in the room. First of all, if you think of finance, before you wonder whether it's ethical, you have to see what it's used for. It's first and foremost for people who have too much money and not enough ideas, and people who have too many ideas and not enough money. So it's a problem of allocation of an abundant resource with no yield over to, and reallocating it to people who have no resources but a lot of ideas. Since the end of the 20th century, finance has become extremely specific, i.e. it's become the most ultimate mean of getting a great number of information to circulate very far away to many people simultaneously. So the volume and technicality of the information that is circulating is unheard of. And this is an innovation that enables finance to become a vector of diffusion and dissemination of collective preferences. The next element, which is primary and basic, and then we can talk about ethics, is that money smells, let's say. At the time of payment, the transaction is over, but you express a collective preference with this. 4,000 years ago in Egypt, once you had slept, eaten, and had children, your only collective responsibility was to build the tomb for your leaders. So now we are and then for several centuries this turned into investments, meaning building huge religious monuments, or the operational expense was to go and free the tomb of the Christ. And then came the Industrial Revolution, which is the big boom we saw, where you see this magic notion of the turning the yield of resources towards production. So in the past centuries, people have been turning their money towards yield and capital gain. And for the past decades, investors have been saying, I want some yield, I want capital gain, but as my investments has a smell or connotation, let's say, I want you to invest my money with more transparency, I want to contribute to the local common good or to decarbonation of economy. It's a bit like investors in the main investing areas like the US, Canada, or other. We're saying, I want a little piece of pyramid, a little bit of a cathedral, a little bit of a crusade integrated into my investment. So the investment is the expression of a collective preference. And along those lines, the discussion on ethics is can finance be the vector? I'm not an economist, but I remember what we used to say. Does it produce positive externalities? If I take the savings of the investors and I fund the energy transition, is it good and is it ethical? Yes, but finance has always gone with preferences, and preferences change. So funds go where preferences go. And the last point that would reconcile the 20th and the 20th century worlds, the decarbonation of the economy generates the highest part of the capital expenditure since the Industrial Revolution. We're talking about mobilizing for the planet several tens of trillions of euros, between 3 and 5 a year until 2030, in order to fund the energy system. So whoever is positioned for this will make interesting investments. So 3 trends, let me finish with this, are going to take as much importance: the aging of the population and the fragmentation of globalization. If you're in one of these elements, whether ethical or not, it's a time for reallocation of investments that naturally drain finance. So collective finance, because it is the expression of a collective expression. But Vespasian used to say that money doesn't smell anything. Well, I disagree with him. Vespasian used to say that, but I disagree. Well, I tend to agree, says Catherine. Hello, everyone. I'm extremely honored and happy to be here with you and with Stéphane for the many reasons you just heard. Talk about the ethical aspect or the phony aspect, let's say. As we've said for a long time, we're going to end up with Spinoza, Aristotle, and lots of ideas that lead you to almost nothing. But if you talk about ethics in finance, do we talk about Quakers? Do we talk about Islamic findings? What do we talk about? It's the best way to dry up the discussion. The discussion is dead before you even start it, if you start looking at the very wide issue of ethical finance. In fact, in many sectors, you tend to reorient the discussion. For example, for agriculture, you have organic agriculture with a rather specific list of specs. And in trade also, you do fair trade with a precise list of specs. So this represents the added value and soul to that. Today we talk about finance, so there's a lot of innovations to get responsible investments, green finance. And as long as you have initiatives like that, you have good and bad. Some people will tell you green finance is greenwashing. Others will say it's the miracle solution to all issues. Well, all this is done on a voluntary basis, and you need to regulate, you need to pass laws in order to be able to know where you're going. And I believe that the main challenge, in my opinion, is that these regulations should not stop the ecological transition, environmental transition. And the management of assets, in my opinion, is one of the smallest issues we'll have to face. And to pick up the words of Jacques Mistral, following the 2008 financial crisis, said, you have to compare finance and nuclear issues. It is as explosive and dangerous as the nuclear sector, and it has to be very well regulated. You don't need an ethical nuclear sector, you need a regulator one. And the same goes for finance. If we were to pick up on what Jacques Mistral used to say, we don't need an ethical finance, but a regulated finance which serves the economy, which itself has to serve environmental or ecological transition, and which itself goes through politics. Yes, okay, but then what kind of quantitative criteria should you use? Exclusion, progression? The factoring in of only one criterion per at a time. Okay, for a decarbonated process, I'll get the children working in Southeast Asia. Sorry if we're being somewhat emphatic or exaggerating, but we're going through through a turning point in capitalism, a transformation of capitalism. Sorry to say this, we don't necessarily see it because it's going to take 20 years, but the preferences, or let's say, the expectations of people who have money as concerns the use that is made of their money are changing institutionally. And as we were saying in the past, it's an issue of the liquidity of capital gain and yield, but also it's an issue of the satisfaction that people get from it. And the use of funds is becoming somewhat professional with the introduction of a number of standards that describe and define what is green, what is brown, etc., what is right or wrong. Today we have a first bias. When we talk about ESG, environmental, etc., it's a whole doll. You have environmental issues, you have charity business for the social part in the countries that have no welfare state, where things are treated by taxes and social action in European countries. And then you have a diversity of governance models with transparency of listed companies. But you're mixing apples and pears, really. In fact, of the new ESG indices, we have 90% of our indices are based on the ESG, whether you call the CAC 40 ESG, the MIP ESG in Milan, or whatever. These indices are more strictly linked to decarbonation so that the main asset managers can direct their investments towards investments that are considered as green to satisfy the demands of their own investors, which are the people who have savings. So it means a huge amount of work because there's a huge amount of standards. And I would like to finish by saying that we should be happy that the elected authorities in Europe have taken on this responsibility, because as you're talking about non-financial performance indicators, as you're talking about ideological indicators, is it better to have diversity or not? How can you develop it? How can you define the diversity of boards, of corporate boards, etc.? All these are political elements. And let me finish and conclude my purpose. It's better if people like Aurore decide on this with others like Javier, Sven, Helmut, and Giovanni, and a few girls in a group. It's better for them to decide the standards rather than what we decided 30 years ago with the accounting standards that define what is worth something. I'm talking about the IFRS standards, were developed by an opaque group of accountants, mainly from North America and Great Britain, who developed the accounting standards that apply to the rest of the globe. So I prefer for my financial standards to be the result of the political deliberations expressing the value system of Europe. And this is the way we're heading. Well, I cannot but agree with what was just said. What we tried to do at European level was to understand what was happening. In order to carry out the ecological transition, we needed to identify elements, to introduce transparency in order to see the evolution, which is why a rather heavy group of laws was introduced. But we're going to improve it and sort of simplify it. So you had the taxonomy, which was very much spoken about to classify the activities. We have also a group of laws on sustainable finance with Article 6, 8, and 9 to define what is good, what is not good, what is doesn't do anything as far as the environment, doesn't have any impact on the environment. And this is the basis of the conflict with the U.S. We have a conflict with the U.S. on the issue of materiality, because what we're interested in at European level is to understand the impact not only of climate change on companies, but also the impact of companies on environmental issues. It's a dual materiality. It's not only the financial aspect. We're interested in the whole thing. And it is true that we have an open conflict with the Americans on that. We're also working on the ESG criteria with a new legislative text that will be suggested by the European Commission. Why? Because some texts are include a lot of things. We need to know how the ESG criteria are defined. We need to know the method. We need them not to be replaceable by each other, and otherwise you add apples and pears. You end up with scandals like Orpea. You need to get rid of an approach like the best-in-class approach, because sometimes the best of the worst is still not very nice. So we are going to work on the ESG criteria at European level very soon in order to clarify all that and to have a more real ecological transition. Yes, absolutely, we need regulation. There are about 250 regulatory authorities taking care of extra financial criteria, 450 environmental labels, 80 reporting initiatives. And when you look at the reports of companies, whether financial or not, like that of Euronext, about half are based on the extra financial objectives in the daily activity of the company, which is a bit worrying, because when you have too many standards, you have a problem. And there's a real strategic issue between Europe and the US. And to conclude the session, I'd like to know if we have any hope. Would we say that for once the Europeans are going to take the lead and with their own standards? And the answer is yes, because we're here to make sure that things happen. We're in the midst of a process. There will be some decanting, but those who are most determined, like the European Parliament, will impose before others standards before the US companies. I would like to talk about the ESG criteria. We have won the battle up till now as concerns dissuasion. The companies that contribute to dissuasion in France are eligible for ESG criteria. Kroc has decided to do the same in the US, because something that was true before the Ukrainian war, but even more true now. In France, if we want to have the Rencontre d'Aix, Mediapart, judges that are paying, if we want to have all that, we need nuclear dissuasion, we need to have special forces to go to Sahel, and a number of tools of anticipation and intelligence that are extremely costly. And obviously, this system of security and defense must be part of our living system and of the feasibility of the ESG criteria. And a number of our European neighbors that didn't have this tradition are admitting this now. Oh, yes, it's true. There's really a huge number of standards. Yes, it's a pain to have to report. But I believe that climate change represents much more constraints and is more difficult to manage than the reporting. It's true that we don't always have the best legislative text. Second thing, you'll have to pick your side. We are in a very tense political situation. We don't know who will be elected in the U.S. We don't know what China is going to do. And we need all the European actors to be behind us. We'll try to protect them as best we can at federal level in Europe. And we'll have to protect even more those who are heading in the right direction financially. Some financial actors like BlackRock are accused of wokeism in the U.S. Because they're including the ESG criteria. And in Europe, they're considered as the big bad wolf because they participate in the pollution of our planet. So at European level, at one point, we'll have to show our strengths at one point and show our teeth, so to say, to defend our industry and apply sovereignty. So neither ethical nor phony finance, but tactical finance. I would say finance at the service of European sovereignty and strategic economy. Thank you.